We will now engage with our next topic of the course, and this topic will see how gender and sexuality intersects with ethnic studies or Asian American studies. And while both Asian American studies and ethnic studies in general deal frontally with race, obviously, well, scholars of these academic fields argue that you cannot really isolate race and ethnicity in a vacuum, so to speak, when you study and analyze race. You can't isolate it from other categories that belong to a person's identity, especially when considering social, political, and economic issues that face society today. For example, wealth and income, distribution, political power, social justice, discrimination, and what have you. So, what we need to understand is that race and ethnicity actually intersect with other categories of identity, and therefore the necessity of studying these categories as interlocking and interweaving. Okay, so while this course primarily focuses on racial identity, we cannot ignore categories such as, gender, sexuality. In fact, if you look at this slide, this is kind of foreshadowing what we'll discuss here. That's the concept of intersectionality as stated here. But in this slide, it shows how these different categories that are sort of markers of one's identity, right? We'll call them categories of identity. Well, they all intersect as illustrated in the slide. One's sexual identity, abilities, disabilities or abilities, gender, right? One's location, geographic location, socioeconomic status, where you're located in how your particular society is stratified socioeconomically, one's ethnicity, and of course race here, one's language, right? And in some areas there's multiple languages, and as you could well imagine, some linguistic communities are marginalized on that simple fact that they are, the minority language, right? Certainly one's age, right? You've heard of ageism and how for example, elderly people are discriminated against. So all these categories we just mentioned, they intersect. And by the way, I'll discuss the concept of intersectionality very soon. But one thing I needed to emphasize is that such categories, they're just not connected. They are interconnected, and they are such in a very profound way. For example, when discussing any contemporary issue like institutional racism, for example, we see this issue as inescapably interconnected with other issues besides race, issues like gender and social class and what have you. So again, don't think of these categories as mutually exclusive to each other, right? They don't just exist side by side with each other. Rather, they're profoundly interconnected. Now, in the humanities and social sciences, a typical approach and framework utilized by such scholars is one whereby social phenomenon is analyzed through the lens of race, gender, and class. Now, sexuality, where's that included? It usually is found in with gender. For example, the study of sexuality is typically found in, let's say, gender and women's studies, right, in academia. So that's where it finds a home typically. But you also see it in sociology or cultural studies, what have you. But back to just race, gender, and class, they are profoundly interconnected. They're imbricated, to use a more technical term. Ultimately, such categories wield an enormous effect upon any particular individual's social location in society. Okay, when you look at how and analyze how such um, identity markers intersect, you could easily imagine how that individual could be marginalized, or it could be, centralized, meaning, if you will, a typical person, right? Or it could even privilege you. For example, imagine in terms of race, Caucasian, because in the United States that's the dominant race ethnicity. Imagine in terms of gender, male, okay, because still we are in a patriarchal society. In terms of social class, imagine the 1%, right? The very wealthy United States. Sexuality, imagine heterosexual. Abilities, imagine someone with abilities rather than quote unquote disabilities. Well, you could go on and on, but you could almost imagine, you could almost bet, right, that this person will be located in the upper echelons of society because of those intersections, right? Now, of course, the argument is not that this is deterministic, meaning that the outcome will obtain 100% of the time, but rather it's argued that such vectors of identity, so to say, greatly shapes one's positionality in society, one's social location, right? So again, such markers of identity are positioned in a social field, so to speak, that is embedded in power relations. Okay, this means that ultimately such categories shape a social hierarchy, right? In that hierarchy, those found at the top, right, are typically the most powerful. Those at the very bottom of that social hierarchy, almost by definition, right, they're the least powerful. So what you see here is really a distribution of power when it comes down to it, right? We're speaking about wealth, influence, certainly political power, even things like status and prestige. Now, going back again to the categories, I just want to re-emphasize that all of these are interwoven, interconnecting, they're overlapping, as stated here. And in terms of one's social location, again, they can't be disassociated from each other. Okay, so again, these categories, race, gender, and class, with sexuality being subsumed under gender in this case, they're not only the organizing principles of American society, they're also determinants of either privilege or inequality. So this brings us to the concept of intersectionality. So intersectionality, as stated here, it's a framework, an analytic framework by which to analyze how multiple identities interconnect and overlap with each other in shaping one's position in society. Okay, so again, a framework focusing on how race, gender, social class, religion, sexuality, nationality, disability, what have you, they all interconnect and overlap in shaping one's social location. And the pioneer in this study, among a few others, but Professor Kimberly Crenshaw was indeed a foremost academic pioneer in the study of how gender intersects with race in particular. And how did she come across her concept of intersectionality, which today is a big part of social sciences and humanities? Well, when she was a law student, actually, in the late 80s, she was studying various court cases whereby African American women were fired from companies or laid off. And a big one was a court case with some African American women let go by General Motors. And such women sued these companies, claiming that they were victims of what we could call compound discrimination, meaning race overlapping with gender. Now, indeed, Crenshaw noticed a similar trend with other cases that African American women were being terminated or laid off in disproportionate numbers compared to, let's say, white men, compared to white women, and even compared to black men. So, in other words, African Americans were first to be let go or fired. So, the judge, looking at this case with General Motors, basically saying this: when we look in terms of race, that is to say, in this case, African American, at that industry, General Motors, you see black men there in that company, and they're doing well. Okay, they're well represented. So you can't say that this is an issue of race discrimination, right? There's no racial discrimination since black men are well represented in the company and they're doing well. Similarly, looking at gender, okay, let's look at women in this case. Well, white women are doing well. Therefore, it's not a matter of gender, according to that judge, right? General Motors can't be discriminating based on gender because you see white women doing well. So, according to Crenshaw, and it is indeed true, the judge was operating along what she called the single axis framework. Okay, the judge was thinking about this case by separating gender from class. He or she, whoever the judge was separating the categories of race and gender rather than interweaving them. So there's no way the judge was thinking of these identities as compounded, to use her term. And this led to Crenshaw's concept of intersectionality. In this particular legal case, such African American women were discriminated based on their identity markers being compounded, right? Compounded with each other, intersecting with each other. And the law failed to see how such identities could be compounded. They only viewed the discrimination by separating, or the lack of discrimination in this case, by separating the categories of race and gender. Again, that's that single axis framework. So again, Crenshaw realized that the experiences of these African American women can not be fully explained by considering any one category on its own. And indeed, this is what was happening with the judge viewing the case through that single axis framework, right? The law was unable to understand the possibility that black women experienced discrimination in a way that was different than both white women and black men. And, based on that single axis framework, people could only be discriminated against based on gender or based on race, not a combination of both. So black women brought forth their unique case. Again, that's that, uniqueness of intersectionality, which involves a mix of both. But again, the court was tunnel visioned, if you will, right? Like, hey, we cannot grant black women special privileges since they're not recognized as this category of the law, right? Black women. Thus, black women had to present cases that were proving discrimination in gender and race. Yet white women were doing well again. Therefore, gender is not the basis for discrimination, the court said. And as I described, black men were doing well in the same industry. Therefore, it's not race. But again, black women still face discrimination that both groups didn't experience. So again, the black women's specific experience couldn't be accounted for in the single axis framework, since the most privileged group within each category set the standard. In the case of gender, it was the white women that was the standard. In the case of race, that is to say African American, the black men set the standard. And one thing I want to emphasize here that with this idea of intersectionality, it's not just adding all the identities together, right? What you need to do is consider them as co-construction, right? They combine and influence each other, thus creating experiences that are unique to that combination. Again, don't just think that they exist alongside each other. Actually, they shape each other, they co-construct